Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. So this one has taken a while, unfortunately. First I had to wait for the update as it brought the T26E5, then I had to wait for its armor to be fixed, and finally I had to wait for my decal. I finally got an affiliate link, which is quite cool, and this is the decal. The chat on the War Thunder official stream realised I look quite like the Doom Mohawk, so we made one for me, with an egg as well. Please don't do anything weird with it. If you use the link in the description, you get 3% off anything in the store, and get this decal too. It's the only way to get it, and any purchase you make directly supports me as well. Also, at time of recording, Wednesday the 24th, we have some planned BR changes coming up tomorrow. I don't know exactly what they entail yet, but I'm relatively certain that at least one of the vehicles in this video will be affected by it. I've already had to delay this video a lot, and I'm not really too keen on delaying it further and potentially having to rewrite and re-record, as if just one vehicle changes, that in turn can affect another, etc, etc. So what I'm going to do is add an unlisted update video in the pinned comment of this one when the changes go live to discuss what's changed. And maybe it would even be interesting to see just how much or how little things change with a BR jump, so maybe we can squeeze a positive out of this poor timing. Anyway, if you're new, this is a series where we take a look at every vehicle in a tech tree tier for tier, go through the strengths and weaknesses, and conclude whether it's worth getting, considering, or avoiding for use in your lineups. In my own opinion, of course. Also, this video is shaping up to be longer than a feature film, so because of that I would recommend watching it in parts, otherwise it might get a bit boring, sorry. Anyway, thanks for being here, and as always, I really hope you enjoy. So first off today, we have another light tank finally, the M41A1 Walker Bulldog. This is a very mobile, but of course, lightly armoured vehicle, with a gun that works very well with some practice. As this is a light vehicle, let's start with the mobility. Once upgraded off-road, it will usually cruise at around 40 kph. It can travel higher than 40 off-road, but it does take a while to accelerate to speed. So the high 30s to low 40s are a more accurate baseline for the speed you'll usually be reaching. On roads though, the speed of this thing really comes into play. It can quickly reach 40 and 50, and on maps like Cargo Port with straight sightlines, it can get up to 60 and 70 with little issue really. It's also a very reactive vehicle as well. The Bulldog has neutral steering, can reach 18 kph in reverse, and accelerates very quickly as well, which lets it maneuver and change positions very easily. Armor is worth a mention, although it's not really something to focus on. The armor of the Bulldog isn't reliable at all. Anything you see can reasonably pose a threat to you, in that there's no vehicle you'll really feel safe engaging. Although it is better than most contemporary light tanks as it doesn't overpressure, which means it won't get one shot with heat or HE. Although a downside to this is because the armor is better, it will set off APHE fuses much more reliably, so pros and cons with that one. There's nothing to really actively keep in mind with the armor, but it is situationally more survivable than most similar vehicles, which is still a plus worth mentioning. Firepower is what rounds this tank off though. It's pretty capable but not always reliable. The main rounds it gets are a solid AP shell and sabot. Interestingly, this Bulldog was the first tank in the entire game to get APDS, so it's a bit of a record holder there. It also gets APCR, which has essentially no value, don't bother with it, and HE and smoke. The firing platform of the Bulldog is really good. On an expert crew, you can get the turret traverse speed to 33.8 degrees a second, which is around the speed that many SPA vehicles have. It also shares an identical reload to the 76 Shermans, and as well, is the first vehicle in the tree that has commander-gunner control, which means the commander has secondary control over the gun. So if you get shot and lose your gunner, if the commander is alive, they can fire back, which especially at this tier can catch enemies out, as it's still a fairly new mechanic and not something commonly expected. The sabot round is pretty good. I'll talk about sabot briefly as this might be the first time you get to use it in the game. Sabot is similar in function to APCR, except it has a much easier time getting through angled armor. Sabot has a very narrow and condensed cone of damage, but the shrapnel in that cone is very powerful. If you hit ammo with sabot, it will almost always one-shot, as long as the round has enough residual energy. So, sabot is good at defeating almost all of the armor you'll come across, but it requires an accurate shot, as it won't cause much damage if the round is poorly aimed. The Bulldog sabot can pen over 200mm at a 30-degree angle, which is great. There isn't much that can withstand this round, but you still can't punch through an angled King Tiger or anything like that. The main issue with the sabot round though is that it's comparatively quite inaccurate. However, this does give the AP round use. If you want to main the Sabo, it's good to have some armor piercing to switch to if you have a tank disabled. Once you've knocked out the breach or engine of an enemy, you can switch to the AP to usually finish them off in one shot. It is really useful for this, but micromanaging the rounds in this way isn't really vital for doing well. It's just something that I do to secure kills, but you'd likely not lose out on much by just taking the Sabo. So there's no need to overcomplicate it if you just want to point and click on stuff. So, how does the Bulldog play? Well, it's quite versatile for a light vehicle, and most of where it should be played depends on maps. The Bulldog can really use its mobility effectively on maps with paved roads, like Cargo Port, Advance to the Rhine, and Seversk 13. So, on maps like this, or at least maps with roads on them, you can afford to push the flanks very aggressively, and because of how reactive the Bulldog is, this is a really good location for it. Any non-linear map that offers a lot of varied pathways into the map itself should be approached like this, as the vehicle's advantages will be the most active in this kind of environment. The only other aspect to consider really is shot placement. On the flanks, you'll likely be engaging enemies from the side, which can be a bit difficult with Sabo. If you know the positions of ammo racks, you'll have no problems at all. Sabo almost always sets them off, but if not, it can be difficult to one-shot tanks from the side. For safety, either shoot the engine or driver first if the tank you're fighting has a slow turret or won't see you in time, or go for the gunner or breach. Both of these approaches work fine, it just depends on what you're fighting. A good option though, and something I do on certain maps, is main the AP. If you're able to engage from the side, AP will do much more consistent damage. It's also very reliable at one-shotting light vehicles. If you're confident with your aim and running on the flanks, AP can be a really good choice. But if you're on a map that may lead you to run head-on into slower, medium and heavy tanks, Sabo will be the safer option. It chews through the front plate of Panthers and similar vehicles, so it is safe like that. Ultimately though, it is up to you, but I personally prefer switching to the AP for flanking. On maps that don't really allow for reliable flanking as much, like Sinai and Karelia, the Bulldog can still work. As long as you can position well, you have the firepower to get through most enemies from the front easily with Sabo. So on these maps, it's a good idea to use your mobility to make a strong initial push into the map and head to a spot in cover where you can react to enemies in a safer way. One thing to keep in mind with this though is autopiloting. It's quite easy in this game to just spawn in and hold W until you meet an enemy. This can work for some tanks, but for a tank like the Bulldog, by the time you meet an enemy, you'll likely be in a poor strategic location and don't have the fallbacks to deal with that. So the aim should be to reach a good map position, not just reach an enemy. So keep this in mind while you play. If possible, try to use a hull down position as well. The hull is way more vulnerable than the turret, not because of the armor thickness, but because of what's behind the armor. The hull is full of ammo and will easily set off an APHE fuse. The turret has no ammo inside of it, and the crew are fairly spread out, so if you take a Sabo or heat round to the turret, it won't always be a one-shot, which does help your potential survivability. The turret face is also quite small comparatively, so if you're sniping, it can be a hard target to hit. Although I wouldn't really recommend sniping down to how inaccurate the Sabo is. Either way, if a good hull down spot exists, I would take it. Regardless though, flanking should always be the playstyle you aim for. And as well, if you get a map that doesn't allow for flanking, you don't need to play the Bulldog. The US has an extensive 6-3 lineup and a 6-7 one too, and the Bulldog will still work there. Although, if you're confident with your map knowledge, you can just roll around from cover to cover into the map. You have the mobility to do this, but it is very easy to get caught out if you don't know exactly where to go. I usually play the Bulldog this way to decent success, but I don't think that solely recommending this kind of playstyle is helpful, as it requires a lot of map knowledge that I can't really include here. But I did want to mention it all the same, as it's still a definite playstyle possibility. Pros: great mobility, good firepower, and versatile. And the cons: poor survivability, and low accuracy for the Sabo. Verdict: definitely get it. The Bulldog is one of my favourite light tanks, and for what it is, it's very versatile and works well beyond its BR. And it works on maps where the other tanks you have access to don't, which is always a plus. It's very versatile for what it is, and if you're someone that likes light vehicles, this can be a really nice tank to play. Next up, we have a pretty unique vehicle. This is the M56 Scorpion, an incredibly mobile and tiny TD with effectively no armor and a very capable 90mm gun. and despite being a TD, it can scout like a light tank, which is really nice. This thing is one of the weakest vehicles in the game. It has a 5mm armor plate protecting the 3 crew members, with one of them sitting off to the side, not even protected by the gun shield. So even light machine guns can take this thing out effortlessly. But it does have the mobility to get around that. The Scorpion has a max speed of 45 kph, which might not seem like a lot, but it can reach this speed very, very quickly off and on road. So it's very consistent mobility-wise. It can also reach 19 in reverse, and because it only weighs 7 tons, it's very responsive and agile when it comes to maneuvering, which is another advantage that it needs to have. The firing platform of the Scorpion isn't fantastic. The gun can only traverse partially to either side, and stock, the traverse on the gun is only 3.6 degrees a second, which is only about 1 degree faster than the M10. The gun is also very unstable on the move and when coming to a stop, which makes positioning this thing absolutely key. Once it's in position though, it can be very effective, and almost all of that is down to the firepower. The gun has a stock 9.8 second reload, but this can be brought down to around 8 seconds on a good crew. The Scorpion comes with many different rounds. A stock APCR round, which is predictably awful, you want to get rid of this one as soon as possible. A Heat FS round, which is functionally the same as regular heat shells but with a lot of penetration. A Hesh round, which isn't very versatile but still has some use. This one can pen 102mm of armor at any angle, so you can hit extremely angled armor and turret roofs and it will still go through. It also smashes through ammo racks if you hit one, but it won't do anything against thicker armor. It's probably the least viable out of the main rounds, but it's still worth taking in case you see a tank that you can't disable using anything else. It's niche, but not useless. The real star though, and possibly the star round of this tier, as we'll be seeing it a lot, is the M82 APHE shell. If I had to pick, this shell would probably be in my top 3 rounds in the game. It's just really fun to use. The penetration varies slightly depending on the cannon, but for the Scorpion, the max pen is 185mm with a strong slope modifier and just under 140 grams of explosive filler, which one-shots nearly everything. It's a really strong round. The penetration does lack when compared to similar guns at the BR like the Russian 100 and German Long 88, but because the Scorpion is so mobile, you'll mostly be hitting tanks in the side anyway. But even so, there's still few vehicles that you'll really struggle with frontally, mostly just the KT-8, Centurions and T-54s, but even then you have the heat shell once you unlock it, so firepower-wise, it really does have a sting in the tail. That is just awful. Do you know what's really depressing about that? I wrote this at about 2:30 in the morning, and there's a little note on the document from myself saying, please come up with something better, you can't use that. Well, screw my past self, I'm going rogue. Anyway, back on track. So, because the Scorpion is so weak, it needs to use the map very effectively to safely get kills. So the main factor in every match should be where you intend to put the vehicle. Loosely speaking, that's the same for every tank, but it needs to be absolutely primary for the Scorpion, because if it gets caught out on the move or out of cover, an enemy doesn't even need to fire their main gun to knock you out. So pick a spot and head there as quick as you can. Because the Scorpion can reach its max speed easily off-road, you'll rarely have any problems getting to where you need to go. Because the traverse rate on the gun is so slow, it's best to watch over a narrow sight line so you're not losing time training the gun on your enemy, unless of course you're sniping at range, as that somewhat mitigates the problem. The Scorpion can traverse its hull very quickly, so if you're not being actively engaged, you can do this to speed up your gun traverse. Additionally, sniping with the heat isn't a bad call either, as it of course carries penetration over range, but it also has a very high velocity of just over 1,200 meters a second compared to the 853 on the APHE shell. Sniping with the Scorpion isn't its ideal position, but it's still a very real possibility, which is useful if you find that you haven't got to a good spot quick enough and need to fall back to a sniping spot. The option of the heat adds a lot of versatility here. But M82 should really be your main round, as the one-shot potential is much higher. The danger of using heat at close range is that even if you disable the breech or barrel of an enemy, they'll still have a machine gun, so you'll need to be careful. Another aspect to be careful of is aircraft. This vehicle is annoying, and if you annoy a player that can respawn in a plane, they will be coming directly for you. You can't exactly dodge a plane intent on strafing you, but you can avoid them for a while. So when playing this vehicle, try to very rarely cross open ground. It's very small, but it's quick, and movement is easy to spot from the air. So always try to stay close to vertical cover to break up your silhouette from someone above you. If a plane is flying around and obviously looking for targets, honestly, just stay still. It might seem counterintuitive, but it really does help. For precise positioning, it mostly just depends on the map. The way I usually play it is to rush to the side of one of the main sight lines or lanes in the map and wait for the slower enemies to roll past. Try and get some range for this if you can though, as in the early stages of the match they do in fact move in herds, so if you knock out one, the others nearby will easily sniff you out. The Scorpion also has 10 degrees of gun depression, which means you can use ridges effectively too, which adds on to another advantage I should have brought up earlier, and that's the size of the Scorpion. It really is tiny, which works in your favour in multiple ways, mostly because it can hide in places other tanks can't. So behind small rocks, static cars on some maps, tank wrecks, bushes, etc, etc. So you really can be hidden in plain sight sometimes. And as well, because you can hide in areas other tanks can't, most players will just skip looking at locations that you could be hiding in, because they know that most tanks won't be there. So sometimes you can just be parked between two cars and an enemy will just roll right past you because the game has taught them what tanks look like, and the Scorpion doesn't look like a tank. I'm not saying that the Scorpion looks like a car either, mind you, but this just works alongside pattern recognition. People are incredibly good at filtering information, what's a threat, what isn't a threat, and if someone has played this game for long enough, it's not uncommon that they'll just filter this vehicle out, or outright just not even see it. Sorry if this is a bit pretentious, but I think it's an interesting point, and in any case should factor into your playstyle on some of the closer range maps. One final factor here though, is that I wouldn't really recommend playing the Scorpion as much on urban maps. The ambush playstyle can work really well, but its max speed is only 45 kph. It can reach this off-road quickly, so if you're playing on a map with paved ground, your mobility advantage isn't increased, but the mobility of basically every other tank is. Some tanks like the T-44 and Panther will beat you on roads, so you'll be less likely to push to a good position early enough without getting caught out. It's not a complete killer to the playstyle, but it is something to hold in mind when playing on these maps. Pros: great mobility, great firepower, and low profile. And the cons: terrible survivability. Verdicts: I'd get it. It's not the easiest vehicle to use and is somewhat map dependent, but it can be a lot of fun and works in up tiers too. As your light tank, this thing or the Bulldog will work fine for the same role, but they just need to be approached differently. So it's mainly down to preference, although a pretty capable replacement for the Bulldog just happens to be coming next. Next up, our last light tank this tier, the T-92. Much closer to the M41 in function than the Scorpion, but still fairly different. Mobility is better in some ways, but a little worse in others when compared to the Bulldog. The T-92 loses the neutral steering, has a much slower reverse gear, and a lower top speed on road, but it is faster off-road, which is generally the more important stat. Its engine is also much less powerful, only having a 340 horsepower engine when compared to the 500 horsepower of the Bulldog, but it is around 6 tons lighter, so mobility is still far from poor. Firepower is again generally an upgrade, although it starts off with terrible stock APCR, the same unlockable shell on the Bulldog. It was terrible at 6.0 and it's still terrible at 6.7, so you'll need to prioritize a better shell as fast as possible. The T-92 loses the AP shell the Bulldog has as well, which is a shame, as from the side it offered a much more reliable damage output. For unlockable shells, the T-92 gets the same Sabo shell as the Bulldog and a new Heat FS round. It's pretty good, but not incredible. 254mm of base pen. This round can get through most of what you fight comfortably, although it still can't get through the hull of an angled King Tiger, so it isn't a point-and-click round for everything. You will still have to aim most of the time. The T-92 also gets commander gunner control, but has a much slower turret traverse. Relatively speaking though, it's about average now. But probably the biggest advantage is the reload. This thing has a 6.5 second base reload that can be bumped down to 5.0 on an ace crew. The ready rack though is only 7 rounds, which dries up quickly, but at the same time, it does replenish quite fast, and offers a pretty big advantage to this thing, as besides autoloaders, it's pretty much the fastest reloading tank at this tier. Armor is similarly unimportant on a tank like this, but it is still a bit more survivable than the front when in cover. The turret has a fairly unconventional design which gives it a quite low and vague profile. The only visible parts of the turret are basically the gun breech and 2 cupolas, and it's fairly common for a round to pass through one of these cupolas and only take out 1 or 2 crew. So survivability does have its positives, for a light tank anyway. The transmission and engine are also positioned in the front of the hull, which can catch some weaker APHE from the front. Not reliable, but again, it is something. For playstyle, the T92 isn't overly complicated, but it's still not the easiest tank to use. At 6.7, it's going to fight a lot more German heavies, which are generally the hardest tanks to take out. This gun is still inaccurate, the Sabo especially will deviate a fair bit, which really is an issue. The heat does do more damage than the Sabo, but they're both rounds that reward accurate shot placement, which isn't great when part of the accuracy is entirely out of your control. This is probably the most difficult aspect to the T92. I played this tank on a stock and ace crew as well, and the accuracy was still inconsistent on both. Playing at close range does mitigate this issue partially, but sniping at range is still a very safe way to play this thing. The hull down silhouette is good, and the reload means that by the time your first shot lands, you can probably follow up a second one before the enemy can even react to you. The reload still does of course have advantages at close range too, but less so. Mostly it just depends on the map. The T92 isn't as fast as the Bulldog, but it is still quick and can flank just fine. On maps that don't allow for flanking, it can snipe and scout and play the support role in that way. Other important aspects here are shot placement and the rounds that you use. For long range, the Sabo is easy to land on an enemy, but not accurately, which can be an issue. Heat is more damaging and more forgiving if the shot lands shy of ammo, but it is a little bit harder to aim. But with some practice, it's not really much of an issue. It's one of those things that quickly gets better with time. For close range, I personally use the heat. Its cone of damage is a bit wider and it just feels more consistent. It can also overpressure anti-air vehicles, which is a nice plus. If you're engaging from the side, there's 2 ways to go about landing your shots. Heat will almost always one-shot a tank if it hits ammo, so if you know where the ammo is precisely, it's a pretty consistent way to dispatch anything. But if not, just aiming for center mass might not actually do any critical damage. So in doubt, aim to disable, go for the breach. Your reload is so fast that you can follow up another shot quickly. It is a good idea though in general to learn ammo racks on these vehicles. So if you meet something in battle that you struggle to deal with, have a look at its X-ray in the hangar, and see if you can find the largest ammo rack. On some vehicles though, not every ammo rack will be filled, so in tandem also look for the rack that says first stage ammo stowage. If the tank you're fighting is still carrying ammo, this one will always be active. It really is a shame though that this thing doesn't have an AP round, as it was a pretty reliable killer. This thing can be a bit more of a needle gun, picking off crew members one by one, rather than spalling shrapnel into all of them. Which though, positive or negative, does let this thing get a lot of assists, so it's not a bad idea to hang around some friendlies and support them with the heat. If you're a player that prefers CAS, the T92 is really a perfect fit. You'll likely not kill but crit anything you hit, which will still give you a lot of spawn points, even more so if you scout enemies for the team. So whatever you prefer, the T92 does have a workable playstyle that will fit. Pros: good mobility, fast reload, decent firepower, and versatile. And the cons: poor survivability and poor accuracy. Verdict: I'd get it. It still isn't objectively better than the Bulldog, but it can do important things that the Bulldog just can't do. So it's safer and more suitable for high tier matches. Personally, I might even say that I prefer the Bulldog just because of the reliability of the AP and the maneuverability in turret traverse, but the reload and heat shell do give the T92 a lot more going for it. So it's definitely worth trying out. Although, even though I recommend using it, if you really don't like light tanks, the Bulldog will still do fine. So, first for our medium tanks this tier is the final tech tree Sherman, the M4A3-76W, which functions quite differently despite being so similar to the M4A2. The only active change is that the M4A3 has a 450 horsepower engine. So firepower and armor are the same, it just accelerates faster and is overall more agile. It doesn't have a higher top speed, but its average speed is faster, which is really the most important thing. This Sherman also does get add-on track armor, but I'm not too keen on it personally. It only slightly covers part of the front plate, with the rest of the protection being on the sides of the hull and turret. And if you're being hit in the side, you're pretty much dead anyway. So at least for me, I don't use the add-on armor on this one. Its extra mobility is what puts it at 5'7", so you really want to get the most out of it. Mobility is also constantly more reliable than armor as an advantage, so it's what I choose to focus on personally. The add-on armor just seems like taking a half measure. It isn't objectively the best choice though, it's just what I prefer. I would recommend not using it to get the most out of the mobility, but if you find the extra armor is helpful to you and how you play it, go ahead, I'm not trying to gatekeep preference. Functionally, everything else is the same though. The Sherman does get an APCR round, the same one the M18 used in the last episode, and similarly I don't think I've ever really needed to use it, so at most only take a couple of shells. So, the drawbacks of the Sherman are mostly just knock-on effects of its BR. You might think that one tiny jump wouldn't change much, but it kind of does here. The way matchmaking up tiers work is that if you're fully up tiered in, say, a 5-3 to 6-3, only 1/4 of each team has the potential to have a 6-3 lineup. This isn't secret information, you can read about it on the wiki, but this means that in most cases, only 3 to 5 players will be using actual top tier tanks. The 5-3 Sherman could compete at 6-3. It would still fight strong opponents like the KTP, T-44, IS-2 Mod, Ho-Ri, etc., but it would only see a few of them in the worst case scenario. Because the Sherman is 5-7, it can potentially see a whole team of them, on top of 6-7s. So it can still absolutely work here, but it certainly isn't as reliable. But this isn't a constant. It can still play exactly the same as the M4A2 at 6-3 and below, and it does spearhead a pretty okay lineup at 5-7 as well. In fairness, it probably could be 5-3, but it's not really for me to say. At 5-7, you have this thing, a backup Sherman, the Hellcat, and a really strong TD that we'll cover at the end. So in up tiers, you don't really need to play the Sherman because the tank destroyers can still work. It's still a usable vehicle, but not really the strongest tank to lead a lineup with, which it does sort of have to do at 5-7. Personally, I still really like it though. The Shermans are my favourite set of vehicles in the game, and despite not being in the strongest position, it still works for what it is. Playstyle doesn't really change at all from the M4A2. As they're so similar, I won't spend heaps of time on this one. Feel free to watch the last video for some more information though, it mostly all carries over. At 5-7, I would play the 76 Sherman platform in exactly the same way. The armour, if correctly angled, can sometimes work, and the gun combined with a stabilizer is still just fine. Annoyingly, you can't apply or remove add-on armor in the spawn screen, which could be nice for some close quarters 5-7 maps, but personally I just keep the armor off. The extra mobility gives it a more active advantage, while the extra armor is passive. If your enemy can click their shoot button very super good, the armor won't really help, but extra mobility will, so that's my thinking anyway. In higher BR games though, I'm talking 6-7 mostly, it's more of a backup vehicle on most of the maps. Your TDs are generally a better pick here, with the Sherman being stronger in the late game. Usually weaker vehicles are rolling around here, and the Sherman can pick them off much more easily. It's also of course not open-topped like other options you have, so another plus against late game aircraft. So I would approach it differently depending on the BR, and by using some of the tactics that we spoke about in the previous videos. Pros? Good firepower, decent mobility, and versatile. And the cons? Unreliable armor, and suffers in up tiers. Verdict? I would still get it. I think it's comparatively weaker than some of the other Shermans, but it can still play the role of a versatile medium decently well. I still enjoy it. By this point, you're hopefully a bit of a Sherman expert by playing all the previous examples, so you should still get some use out of this one. It's also a low BR for a rank 4 tank, so if you really like the Shermans, it could be a nice one to talisman if you want to speed up research this tier without playing some of the higher BRs. So next up, we have a bit of a change in design. This is the T25, which resembles the premium T20 from the last episode. But this one is fairly different across the board. Firstly, it's upgunned. This thing comes with the first of the regular 90mm M3 cannons, so this version is a bit less powerful than the variant on the Scorpion, but it's still very effective. It comes with M82, stock AP, and APCR. The M82 on this version loses around 10mm of penetration across the board, but functionally they're very similar in all honesty. The AP becomes redundant the second M82 is unlocked, featuring slightly worse penetration and nothing else really. And the APCR is still APCR, but it's better. This version can get through a max of 287mm of armor, which isn't useless to be honest. This thing can get through the turret of the KTH and the Centurions if you do end up fighting them. So take a few APCR rounds with you on this one. You'll likely rarely need to use it, but it can offer some advantages over the APHE this time around in the right situation. Apart from that, it has the same gun depression and turret rotation speed as the Shermans, so it's very reactive. Not as reactive as it was though, as fairly recently the T25 lost its stabilizer. This was chiefly down to the model of T25 we have currently being slightly inaccurate. There were two pilot models of the T25 and the version in game is a sort of mishmash of both of them. The stabilizer was just removed to make the current model as accurate as possible. But it's not unlikely that we'll see the stabilized version in game at some point in the future, along with a rework of this one. One thing to mention initially here is that the stabilizer is pretty much what brought it to 6.3. Now that it's lost it, it probably won't stay there. It's still perfectly usable at 6.3, but of course not as good, and the BR probably will reflect that going forward if I had to guess. Anyway, on to the armor. Protection-wise, it's nothing reliable most of the time. If angled at range, the hull can sometimes bounce shots from the German 75 and Short 88, but unangled, they will get through, along with anything bigger of course. The turret is a fair bit better though. It has an internal 25mm spore shield and brace behind the mantlet, with the same thickness as the turret front. The mantlet is variable thickness armor, but just going over the turret protection, it's honestly pretty good. At range, the German 88 and 75 can barely get through, and even then, because the internal breach is so large, it usually soaks up all of the shrapnel, so protection here is honestly okay. The long 88 will usually rip right through the middle, but it can still bounce if it hits the edges of the mantlet, so hull down protection for a medium tank at 6.3 isn't bad. Mobility is pretty workable too. It isn't fast, but it's okay. When spaded, you'll likely be cruising around the low 30s off-road and the mid-40s on-road. It will take a while to reach its max speed of 50, you'll probably not reach it on most maps, but it is possible. It also has neutral steering and a fantastic reverse gear. This thing can go as fast forwards as backwards. You can actually reach 50 kph in reverse, which makes this thing very responsive, even though it's not the fastest in a straight line. The difficulty in explaining a tank like this is that there isn't really much that it absolutely can't do. It's one of those vehicles where you can just roll around the map, head to good spots, and click on tanks. I'm not trying to pretend it's that simple, but there's nothing about the vehicle that actively holds it back. Armor passively holds it back, but if you're confident and know where to put the T25, it will consistently do pretty well. The gun mostly one-shots anything you hit, and the mobility lets you get around adequately enough. There aren't really any gimmicks to keep in mind with this thing. Getting the most out of a vehicle like this is mostly just general game knowledge, like good map positions and shot placement. Personally, I play this thing in a very general way, just driving into the map, heading to a spot I know works, and reacting from there. A hull down spot is of course ideal, as the turret protection is way more reliable than the hull. It isn't vital to play in a spot like this, but it can help improve survivability somewhat if the map allows it. Also, try not to engage as a frontline vehicle. The 90mm is good, but it will struggle head-on with certain tanks, and you certainly can't reliably brawl with them. So you'll need a slight angle to reliably take almost anything out. The M82 shell has great angled penetration performance, so you usually only need a tiny bit of the enemy's side armor to get through. For the KTH, either go for the barrel or the side of the turret. Because the turret of the KT is rounded, you can get through it even if the turret is only slightly pointed away from you, which is a pretty reliable way to take it out, usually in one shot. One unnecessary but gimmicky tactic you can use though is playing this thing backwards, as it can travel as fast forwards as it can in reverse. Playing this way basically forces an enemy to go for your engine, which leaves your crew undamaged most of the time, or risk a shot into the turret, which may bounce. You can win engagements like this, but it usually leaves you with a long repair time if you win, and it also makes you vulnerable to vehicles you otherwise wouldn't be vulnerable to. So it's not a universally useful tactic. One final thing is to keep your turret pointed directly at an enemy if you know they're about to fire at you. The turret face next to the mantlet will normalize if you angle away slightly, and it's fairly easy for any enemy at this tier to get through. Pros: great firepower, effective mobility. I mean this in terms of traverse rate and reverse gear, not straight line speed. Good hull down protection, and versatile. And the cons: poor hull armor. Verdict: I'd get it. It's almost entirely outclassed immediately at 6.3 by the next vehicle, but even so, the T25 is still a perfectly workable medium tank. and in any case it's a good backup. Will it see a downturn in the future? Probably. If it does end up at 6-0, it still won't have the best lineup, but it will have something at least. So definitely pick it up for the future, and give it a try in the present too. So next up we have a very famous tank, the M26 Pershing. Very similar to the T25, just with some pretty substantial buffs to the armor. It uses the same 90mm M3 cannon with the same core rounds. Stock AP, although the Pershing gets a slightly better AP round, M82, APCR, and a smoke shell as well. Mobility is all around worse though. It's slightly slower off-road and on-road too, no neutral steering, and a slower reverse speed. It can still reach 14 in reverse though, which is just fine most of the time. Defensively, you could argue that the T25's reverse speed was excessive, so it's not necessarily a downgrade. Armor is the main draw here though, and I think it's often underappreciated. There are a lot of vehicles that, unless they get a really spot-on hit, can't really get through this thing. At several hundred meters, if angled, the hull of this thing is immune from the Tiger 1, Panther, Russian 85, the French 90 and 75, and at around 700 meters or so, even the long 88 really struggles to reliably break through. The turret is pretty strong as well, but not quite as reliable as its thickness can't be improved by angling. From the front, only the direct sides of the turret face and the middle of the mantlet can be penetrated by common AP and APHE shells. The sides of the turret face and the outer portion of the mantlet is close to immune from a lot of these rounds. Even the long 88 struggles on some sections because of the overlap. I don't want to spend too much time here on the armor particulars, so I would recommend looking at it yourself in game at your own pace, as that will give you a better idea of the protection, more so than what I can just explain here. Generally though, for a medium tank, the armor is quite reliable. The hull though does have some weak spots, ones you generally can't do anything about. The machine gun port is completely flat, any contemporary gun can get through, as well as the corners of the lower plate. These flatten and normalize, creating another easy weak spot, especially at close range. To an extent, these can be mitigated by angling, but not entirely. It does make them less prominent though, which is pretty much the best you can hope for. The Pershing's armor is at its best when utilizing the window of reaction time. I've spoken about it a bit before in previous videos, but I will mention it again here. The window of reaction time is the amount of time it takes for an enemy to acknowledge you and fire at you. There isn't exactly a set amount of time for this to happen, but for a vehicle with workable armor like the Pershing, one of several things happens when engaging an enemy. Either they fire without aiming and usually bounce on your armor, or they take too long to aim, allowing you to fire back, not counting the instance where they just aim and don't penetrate. A well-armored vehicle gives you advantages at both potential outcomes, but it requires some user input to work properly. To maximize the window of reaction time you have, you need to make sure you avoid making yourself an easy target. This means that if you're out of cover, keep angled, ideally by pointing the corner of your hull towards the enemy or where enemies could be, and as well staying on the move. Either drive forwards or backwards at an angle if an enemy is aiming at you. The main point of doing this is that it ensures that the parts of your armor that are either vulnerable or strong keep changing. The angle of your tank relative to the enemy is altering by the second, and that combined with the fact that an enemy will have to lead their shell to hit you makes landing an accurate shot pretty difficult, and in short, that's what makes the armor of the Pershing work. The Pershing is the first vehicle in this tree with workable side armor. It's 76mm of RHA, which is really strong when angled, unlike the Sherman or T25. The M26 is like the Tiger in that if unangled, the armor is pretty much worthless, but if angled, it's actually pretty good, more so than the Tiger actually. This reaction principle works for the turret armor as well. The middle portion of the mantlet is the only part that most enemies can pen. So, if you're sniping at range and only have your turret visible, park your hull sideways or at least at an angle to the cover you're sitting behind. So if you move when an enemy fires at you, your movement will throw the enemy's aim off, meaning they're not hitting the middle of the mantlet anymore if they were aiming for it. So lateral movement is key here. Landing a shot is generally about vertical accuracy and not horizontal accuracy. An enemy can line up their vertical crosshair with a piece of your armor, but that doesn't mean they'll get the range right. So deviating laterally will throw their aim off more so than moving vertically. The most important thing to get working with the Pershing is an understanding of this reaction time. If you can master it, everything else honestly just falls into place. The Pershing is still very versatile with no other gimmicks. As long as you can land your shots accurately and position your tank well, you'll get a lot out of this vehicle. The only other aspect to keep in mind is the slow speed. This thing, especially stock, is heavy tank levels of slow, so mobility upgrades are very important here. You need to move your hull quickly, so make sure you get the tracks upgrade as soon as you can, after M82 of course. Also, and this may sound rudimentary, look for roads on the map. Driving on them will speed up your movement and they're almost always marked on the minimap, so actively keep an eye out for them and use them as much as possible in your initial push. A sort of passive advantage of the Pershing's slow speed is your gun stability actually. Below 20 kph on flat ground, it's fairly stable and will stay stable while you roll to a stop, which will really help this reaction time window further. Pros: great firepower, good armor, and versatile. And the cons: poor stock mobility, and weak hull armor if unangled. Verdict: definitely get it. It is a tough tank to really get the hang of, but once you have it spaded, learn the gun and how to angle, it can be a really powerful medium on the right maps. There are some tanks that you'll struggle with, sure, but with some practice, it can be a really reliable workhorse for this tier. So next up, we have the M4A3E2 76W, which, despite having effectively one single change to the previous jumbo, it might take a while to go through. Mobility and armor are completely identical across both jumbos. The only difference here is the gun. The 75 has been replaced by the 76, and because of this one change, its battle rating has increased from 5.3 to 6.3. And if that BR jump seems unreasonable, I will do my best to explain why it isn't. On the surface, I can appreciate that it might seem a bit strange why a tank with the armor of a 5.3 and the gun of a 4.7, not counting the M10 as it's not really comparable, is at 6.3. Because, in a disconnected sense without actually playing it, those advantages don't seem all too special. And I think that's the core issue people have with this vehicle, in that when being discussed, players will disconnect its attributes and advantages in a very black and white way that ends up being very disconnected to its actual functional performance. So I think for a lot of people, the issue is in the perception of the vehicle itself, not to sound too pretentious, but this tank is still extremely good. I say still because it was recently up-tiered from 6.0 to 6.3. And before I say this following point, I want to hammer down the fact that I don't think this following opinion here is objectively correct and that other people should just adopt it. But in my experience, I found that it performs a lot better now at 6.3, for the reason that a lot of the common enemies at 7.3 are very squishy. The 3 BMPs, the Marder, the Italian and French light tanks, and the Leopard. And I don't know about you, but I would much rather fight a team full of Leopards and BMPs than King Tigers in this thing. You can of course now fight the T-54-49 and the Centurions, but Britain rarely fights the US, and even then you're only going to see a handful of these tanks in full up tiers anyway. And generally speaking, a lot of the tanks at 7.3, or at least used in 7.3 lineups, are a lot easier to kill. So effectively, the pool of vehicles that you'll end up seeing in up tiers is diluted by weaker tanks, in terms of protection anyway. 6.0 to 7.0 is generally the last leg of the armor meta, Tiger 2s, the IS-3, Ferdinand, etc. And at 7.3, it slowly starts heading the other way with a focus on mobility. What I'm getting at with this is that the gun still works at this BR, and for tanks that you can't get through easily from the front, you still have a short stabilizer, and bar the Centurions, you're almost the only other vehicle at this BR that has one, which is a huge advantage, and one that I think a lot of people drastically underestimate. A lot of this will retread topics we spoke about in the last video, so sorry for that, but the stabilizer effectively means that you can get the first accurate shot off on an enemy every time. So if you can't penetrate a tank frontally, you can hit the barrel and either flank them or aim for weak spots. You can still very reliably do this, and as well, it's still a jumbo. You will still bounce shots if you can rush an enemy into firing. I'm not of course going to pretend that this is always reliable, but it absolutely still happens. You will still see tons of Tiger 1s, Panthers, vehicles using the Russian 85, and all sorts of tanks that can't just point and click at you. These tanks don't just magically disappear above 6.3, just because other vehicles with better guns exist. And that leads on to the main point that I want to make with this section, which is the issue of perception. I still spend a lot of time for work or otherwise watching videos on War Thunder and checking through the Reddit and the forum, and I see the same points about the Jumbo come up a lot. We even had an hour-long discussion regarding it on my Monday stream on the War Thunder channel. So, in the following section, I just want to collect the common talking points I see and try and break them down a bit. The first point I want to bring up is the Leopard 1. I see a lot of comments that effectively say the Jumbo should never fight a Leopard, like that on its own means something, like it's its own statement. But if we look at the Jumbo versus the Leopard, it's not like it's a completely unfair fight. The Leo is faster, more mobile, and can fire more powerful shells, but that's basically it. On the move at high speed, the Leo's gun is very unstable. It also only has 4 crew and not a lot of armor. Outside of the middle of the mantlet and the upper hull, the Jumbo can frontally penetrate the Leopard anywhere. The Jumbo is likely getting the first shot off, and because the Leopard has weak armor, it's not a difficult task to penetrate it. It's easy for either vehicle to destroy the other if played to their strengths. So it really isn't the end of the world that these tanks can now fight each other. And I don't think people are ignorant of this. From my perspective, the issue is that the Leopard is a far more modern vehicle, and that's what people don't like. I admit this is a really stupid analogy, but if in some alternate universe the Leopard 1 was made and fielded in 1945, and still in modern day in War Thunder had the same BR, people would probably be instead complaining that it's unfair that the Leo has to fight the Chieftain Mark III. It's silly, but hopefully demonstrates partially that this argument has no real place when making a point about vehicle performance. War Thunder has changed its tune a bit over the last few years, to the point where it isn't really historically accurate, but historically authentic. And sure, you may think that those are two buzzwords that effectively mean the same thing, while simultaneously offering some leeway with the definition either way, but what it effectively boils down to is that vehicles are implemented as authentically as possible, and matchups are made purely on performance. I could go on about how easy it is for the Jumbo to take out the Leopard, or even put a compilation on screen of me killing 100 Leopards in the Jumbo, but someone else could easily do the same thing but killing 100 Jumbos in the Tiger 1, but it doesn't prove anything other than that it's possible, which I don't think anyone was denying in the first place. These tanks are incredibly different, so usually I wouldn't have much use directly comparing them. It's like comparing the Scorpion to a King Tiger and saying the Scorpion is worse because it has no armor. It's a non-issue in the playstyle. The vehicles are just different and work in different ways to different strengths, which is very much the case here. And it just so happens that the Jumbo strength is much easier to employ than the Leopards on most maps, which is part of the reason why the BRs are where they are. This ease of use goes for most of the tanks it fights, which leads into point 2. You've probably seen a lot of those cherry-picked tank comparisons on the Reddit that probably look something like this. No disrespect to the people who make these, I just thought it was funny. But these comparisons can sometimes have merit and make a decent case for certain vehicles being poorly implemented. But most of the time, and for the Jumbo, they basically always miss the reasons why the Jumbo is so good. Tanks at its BR can penetrate it, and it doesn't matter. Tanks at the BR are more mobile, and it doesn't matter. Other tanks at the BR have better armor, and it doesn't matter. I always see these tanks compared using cold numbers, or rather, that the Jumbo is compared to other vehicles in scenarios that are disconnected from how the vehicles are most often and most commonly used. Sure, at long range, if the Jumbo is out in the open, a King Tiger, Panther or Yak Panther is likely going to win. If a Leopard or AMX-13 gets the Jumbo's flanks, it's likely going to win. What's the Jumbo going to do against an IS-3 at 1,000 meters? Case closed, the Jumbo is bad. You can effectively make these hollow arguments for every vehicle matchup in the game. How is the T-34 1940 getting through a Churchill gun carrier at 1,000 meters? Therefore, poorly balanced. How is a KV-1 Ist getting through an M4A2 76 at 1,000 meters? Therefore, poorly balanced. The issue with doing this, and trying to make a hard point using these examples, is that these engagements, while not impossible by any stretch, aren't indicative of the ways that these vehicles are most commonly played, by any stretch. Most maps don't even allow for these sorts of situations to even happen, and even then, maps don't force you to enter a sniping match with a Tiger II a mile away. Basically every single map will let you take the Jumbo to close range engagements, and once you're there, you can beat all of these vehicles in one way or another. You can fire accurately at them first, and your 76mm gun reloads faster than the cannon on every single medium and heavy tank from 6.3 to 7.3 that doesn't have an autoloader. On paper, the tanks that you fight do have advantages over you, but in practice, you in turn have advantages to counter their advantages. The stabilizer, reload, and workable armor give you a constant set of strengths over your enemy. If a fast enemy is rushing your flank, you can swing the hull around and fire at them quickly with the stabilizer. If you run into a tank you can't pen frontally, you can use the stabilizer to aim for the barrel and follow up a second disabling shot very quickly. And if you do find yourself on a long-range map with heavy vehicles you can't disable at range, don't drive into long-range sightlines. Push into the map using cover, and only engage enemies at a range that you're comfortable with. The Jumbo is very capable of doing this, and is great at putting the pressure on at close range. And if you're on a map where you don't know what to do with the Jumbo at all, 6.3 is a really good lineup. You don't need to take it out if you feel that its strengths aren't applicable. If anything is overpowered in this game, it's lineups, but that's a different topic for another time. I won't go too heavily into the advantages of the Jumbo here, as I already had a big segment on the last Jumbo and Shermans in general in the previous episode, and this segment is already way too long. And at the end of the day, both Jumbos don't really play too dissimilarly from each other at their respective BRs. The strengths that they have remain largely unchanged. Pros: good firepower, fast reload, workable armor, and versatile. And the cons: prominent weak spots. Verdict: absolutely get it. Sorry if I spent too long here discussing the community's issue with the Jumbo 76 rather than talking about precisely how to play it, but if you're of the opinion that the Jumbo is truly over-tiered and useless, you won't, at least from my perspective, approach it correctly and enjoy it. If you still don't agree with me, that's completely fine. Maybe I am way off the mark. But if after watching this you're willing to give the 76 a try, it can be heaps of fun. Again, I would recommend watching the last episode as we go into weak points and the general advantages of the Jumbo there, which is still very much applicable here to the 76 version. Sorry for dragging this one out a bit, but it's one of my favourite vehicles in the game, and I'd just like everyone to enjoy it as much as I do. Next up, we have a very new addition, the T26E5, which is probably one of my favourite vehicles that's been added for a while. This thing is essentially a slower Pershing with the same gun and much better armour. The mobility is actually quite a bit worse. The T26 is around 5 tons heavier while retaining the same engine, so it's very sluggish, especially on hills. And when stock in general, it's just a real slog, to be honest. But its spaded performance at 6.3 is incredible, really. I don't want to spend too much time on the cold numbers of the armor, as mostly variable thickness and hard to present a total picture of, but I will be as brief as possible. Side armor is unchanged from the regular Pershing, which is fine. The hull has 50mm of extra armor on the main segment, with the bulge in the upper middle section being 242mm thick. Apart from the machine gun port, the entire hull, if angled, is immune to the long 88. Also, just a brief tangent here, you're possibly a bit tired of hearing me compare essentially all armor to the long 88 all the time, but I just do this because it forms a good baseline. If armor is good against the long 88, it's reliable against every other similar gun. So, the upper hull is brilliant. The lower plate is still very weak though. It's thicker but has less sloping than the M26, so it's in effect easier to get through. Although, if you angle, the lower hull is still immune from the Tiger and Panther at general combat ranges. The turret armor is similarly very impressive. The mantlet itself is 177mm thick, with the turret face extending behind most of it, protected further by a brace, and in the areas that aren't covered, the same 25mm spall shield can catch some of the shrapnel. On the areas covered by the mantlet and turret face, there's effectively nothing that can get through. This goes for the sides of the turret as well when viewed from the front. The German 128, the British 20-pounder, all of these guns will bounce on the edges of the turret mantlet. The middle of the mantlet though only has around 180mm of effective thickness when including the spall shield. But this is still really good, especially considering that the weak spot is vague. When you're looking at this thing and only have a few seconds to fire, it is difficult to land the shot perfectly, especially if employing the same reaction window maneuvering tactics as the Pershing. Despite the lack of mobility, these same tactics still very much work here, and increase the armor even further. But there are some issues I can see popping up, more so in the future. This is closer to a speculation more than anything objective, but I do want to balance the praise of this vehicle with some potential downsides, so I can be as fair towards it as possible. The issue with this vehicle's armor is that the strong points are really strong, that might sound stupid, and its weak points are very weak, the lower plate and cupola especially, as well as the muzzle brake. The armor of the M26 Pershing is more vague. The hull and turret can both bounce shots, but they won't always, so an enemy, knowing this, is more likely to aim for the riskier parts of the armor than spend time aiming for weak points. They've got through the hull and turret before, maybe they will again. But for this thing, the hull and turret are no-goes for a lot of the common cannons, and once enemies start to realise this, they'll likely start shooting explicitly for these weak points, the lower plate, barrel and cupola. This can actually be a downside to tanks with strong armor. If the armor is too strong in a wide area and weak in a small area, after a few engagements, a player fighting the tank will just ignore the strong armor entirely, which does lessen its effectiveness. This isn't an entirely fair assessment though, as strong armor will still be good at catching poorly placed shots, but this will effectively always happen anyway. But a good player will be aiming for weak points precisely, like how someone who's played the jumbo for a while will shoot the barrel of a Tiger II and not the turret face over and over. The armor is made somewhat irrelevant in these situations by analysing the weak spots. So what I'm saying is effectively boiling down to, because the armor is less vague, it's easier for players who have looked at the armor to exploit it. I'm only really bringing up this point here as it's a very new vehicle, and as such will probably go through a lot of changes. But even though this isn't exactly an objective talking point, I think it's worth considering for the future anyway, so I just wanted to taper expectations a bit. Regardless of the concern though, the armor in my experience has been incredible. The footage in the background is from a 24-0 game I had where I think I only took one critical hit. Mind you, I don't like using one game to try and prove a broad point, that's just dishonest, but the experience I had in this match generally carried over to the other matches as well. When looking at this vehicle before playing it, the armor did look great, and to put it to the test, the games I played were mostly all around 1 AM, and I generally tried to just hold W and be as lax and aggressive as possible. If the armor was good, it would save me against my somewhat poor positioning, and it constantly did. Although, the reason I wanted to go into the future performance of the vehicle before is that this thing looks a lot like the Pershing, and at time of recording, it's only been out for a week. Most players either can't currently differentiate it from the regular Pershing, don't even know what it is, or don't understand its armor layout. And these are all aspects that will evolve with the culture of the game. So even though I'm really praising the armor right now, I do want to mention that it will naturally become less reliable over time. It's a bit like when ground forces first came out. At the time, you couldn't directly see armor values, and the community somehow decided amongst themselves that the driver's hatch on the T-34 was the weak spot, despite being the strongest part of the armor at the time. After perception shifted and the armor values became more visible, the armor did start working less. Regardless though, right now it's incredibly strong and works almost exactly the same way as the M26. It's at the same BR, so the gun characteristics won't change, and the armor works to the same strengths almost exactly. The only extra aspect to keep in mind though is the mobility. It's awful stock and still not that great when spaded. Your reactive mobility is very slow, so an enemy pulling up on your side can be a real danger because you likely won't be able to swing the hull around in time. So I would recommend playing hull down if you haven't yet unlocked the various mobility upgrades. If a hull down spot doesn't exist on the map you're on, try and hang back a bit from the front line and stick with your team. Most enemies will be able to outmaneuver you if you're on your own, or just if they're generally close to you. This is the only thing you're vulnerable to, so mitigating it should be key. When spaded though, this thing can be as good a frontline heavy as the jumbo, just playing to different strengths. Just make sure that you keep angled and keep on the move if you're being shot at, and the armor will work wonders. Although, hull down does work really well too if you can find a good spot. You're a really tough nut to crack in this position. Another advantage of the turret actually is its ability to angle. The sides of the turret are very strong, so if you can angle slightly with the edge of the turret cheek towards the enemy, there's very little that can get through this. The Russian 100 and Long 88 will bounce on this turret cheek at an average range. This does though make a shot into the mantlet more reliable for an enemy to get through, but there are still two pluses that come with this. Firstly, if a shot enters the mantlet at this angle, it will only destroy the breach, keeping your crew safe, and as well, the Pershing has been a common enemy for these teams for a very, very long time. The side of the Pershing's turret is weak, So if an enemy sees the side of one of these turrets, they will likely take the easy shot and not risk the mantlet. So angling your turret in this way can be a good suggestion to the enemy. One final point though is that this thing is not the best suited for up tiers. The mobility will hold it back a lot here, especially if it isn't upgraded, and while the armor will still work at 7.3, you will see a lot more tanks that can defeat it easily without having the mobility advantages to counter this aspect. But as we mentioned before, 6.3 really is a brilliant lineup. So you really don't need to take it in these situations if you don't want to. Pros: great firepower, great armor, and versatile. And the cons: poor stock performance, and poor mobility. Verdict: there's no point in these really, is there? Definitely get it. It's a slower Pershing with better armor effectively, and it's comfortably more forgiving in comparison too. You will need to get the mobility upgrades to really make it work, but if you give the vehicle that time, it will reward you very well. Hi guys, little unscripted part here. So the T26E5 has had its armor reworked a little bit since I recorded the main segment, and as to not lose too much time, I'm just going to tack this on to the end as opposed to rewriting the whole thing. The changes don't change much as the vehicle is still 6.3, but the tank has changed a fair bit regarding the armor, at least to a point where it's worth mentioning. The mantlet has changed to volumetric thickness, but it still holds the same protection, so not a lot changes there. But the bulge on the main plate underneath the mantlet has been extended partially, so its effective thickness extends below where it did before, which makes it even stronger, and the lower plate has been increased in effectiveness a lot. If you look closely right now, it doesn't quite match the model itself. Because the model is incorrect, the lower plate should be more sloped, so instead of spending the time and going back to the modelers and waiting until it matches up, the thickness of the armor is as it should be right now, even though it doesn't match with the model. And this means that because of the angling, the middlemost section of the lower plate is much stronger. Basically, nothing can reliably get through this now. The Tiger and Panther can still get through the very corners, but if angled and on the move, it is really difficult to get through this. Even when front on right now, the Long 88 can't get through the middle of the lower plate, or even the front plate really, so now if angled, it's way stronger. Just to show though, if you are maybe fighting this vehicle, the weak points are basically now the muzzle brake, which is very big and easy to hit, and the cupola. Even the Tiger 1 can get through this cupola at a decent range, and if it does get through, it will usually cripple the crew. You can also potentially get through the bulges with division ports on either side of the hull, as they are quite weak, but it's a pretty tricky shot, but it's still possible. Because of these changes though, I can't really see this thing staying at 6.3, which is a shame, as if it goes to 6.7, we'll then have 3 6.7 heavy tanks, so I'm not sure what's going to happen to this one. So maybe this segment will get outdated kind of quickly, I'm not sure, it depends how the vehicle performs. But I did just want to add this bit onto the end here, so it is as up to date as possible by the time the video goes out. I'll probably add something in the addendum about what changes with this vehicle, as I can see a lot of changes happening, but I guess we'll see. Anyway, on to the next vehicle. Next up, another T-Series tank. This is the T26E1-1. Quite an interesting modification. This is the first tank in the main tree to equip the Long 90. This thing can fire the T41 APHE shell, which is honestly quite close in penetration performance to the Long 88, with the same filler as the Short 90, so its damage potential is brilliant really. We'll go back to the gun a bit later, but the most visible change here is of course to the armor. This thing is the base model of the M26, but with some captured armor effectively welded onto it. Engineers managed to weld an 80mm plate from a destroyed Panther onto the mantlet, as well as two 38mm structural steel boiler plates fitted onto the hull by the 3rd Armor Division. It also received these structural steel ears, I guess, covering the side of the turret as well. This protection is pretty good, but not always enough to justify the hit to mobility. This thing is just over 8 tons heavier than the regular M26 and still uses the same engine, so it's much slower than even the T26E5, which does limit what it can do. The armor is functionally okay though. The mantlet is almost immune from the Long 88, only being able to get through the mantlet right next to the gun at close range, which will only really take out the breach. So this area is really strong. The structural steel though only has a 0.45 armor modifier, which means it only offers 0.45 times the actual thickness presented. So the steel visibly adds around 115mm of presented effective thickness, but functionally only offers around 50 on most of the plate, which is still not bad at all really. If angled, you can bounce almost all of the common APHE shells you'll come across. Apart from the IS-2 though, as that round will just overmatch through the steel, so watch out for Russian 122s. Also, because the steel visually blocks off the base armor, it's hard to see the weak spots on the lower plate. The corners can be penetrated, but the middle section can't, and because of the steel, it makes it hard for an enemy to accurately aim at these weak spots, especially if you aren't staying still. All around though, I do quite like this tank. It's the first vehicle in the tree that can reliably fight at long range. The short 90 is still workable, but it's much weaker than this thing. The muzzle velocity and penetration are higher, making it much easier to punch through enemies at distance. This is something the tree needed, but I still think we need something like this at 6.3 to give the lineup the versatility it was lacking. But anyway, this gun is very versatile, but it unfortunately has quite a large drawback, and that's the reload. This thing has a 16.2 second base reload, which is very uncompetitive when compared to every other gun with similar performance. Historically, this is down to the size of the 90mm shells being quite difficult to load inside of the turret. But I think personally at least that this is one of those cases where historical liberties can be taken for the sake of balance. Even shaving off a few seconds would help this tank a lot, as it's already held back quite a bit by the mobility. On an ace crew, you can get the reload down to 12.5 seconds, but this is still longer than the stock reload of the King Tiger and T-54 etc. Which is important to keep in mind, as it means that if you trade a shot with an enemy, they're almost always going to be able to reload faster than you. And because of this, this thing ends up being more of a support heavy, I guess, in that it can't reliably brawl quite as well as other heavies. The reload is unforgiving, and its mobility holds it back even further. So this is a heavy tank that doesn't really forgive mistakes, like a true heavy would, I guess. That's not to say that it can't play at close range though, it definitely can, as you will still see Tigers and Panthers and the T-44 etc. that will really struggle frontally with this armor. The E1 is still quite versatile despite all the negative points I've focused on so far. Its hull down performance is great, and the gun works nicely at long range, so this can be a good spot for it if you're up-tiered or on a long-range map. A spot like this lessens the negative effects of the mobility as it's not coming into play if you're sitting behind a ridge, and the reload is partially mitigated because you aren't trading shots and can just pull back into complete cover once you fire. This is a safe spot for it, but a spot like this isn't feasibly accessible on every map for this vehicle. So, at close range, you'll need some kind of buffer between you and your enemy. This can either come in the form of a teammate or hard cover. What you effectively need to protect against is an enemy pushing you while you're on reload, or getting so close to you that they can just drive around you. So when you're engaging, try to maintain at least a 10-second distance between you and your enemy. Ideally more than this, but just try to keep it in mind that the closer you are to an enemy, the more vulnerable you are. So don't push in unnecessarily. One of the weakest parts of your armor are the turret cheeks. The area right next to the mantlet can be easily penetrated by Tigers and Panthers etc. So the weaker guns can still pose a threat to you here at close range. So effectively all you're doing in this situation is making your armor weaker when at long range the gun will still work. So if you do find yourself at close range, just make sure that you're constantly pointing your turret directly at an enemy if you know you have to take a shot. Apart from the caveats, this is still a tank that is quite versatile. It has disadvantages everywhere it plays, but it can still play everywhere, I guess. Nothing effectively stops it from taking out enemies at close range or long range. But this is a tank that you should be careful with and approach it a bit more passively, at least from the start. The repair cost of this thing is pretty large at 18.5k when spaded, so you won't want to lose this tank unnecessarily. In general, I'd recommend playing in more of a support playstyle. You can definitely brawl if you're confident, but especially when stock, it's worth hanging back around some cover and just popping out to fire off a shot. Pros: great firepower, good armor, and versatile. And the cons: poor mobility, poor stock performance, and long reload. Verdict: I'd still get this one. It's probably the least reliable heavy this tier in my opinion, but it can still be pretty fun. The gun is fantastic, and the armor is still far from useless. When played carefully, this thing does still have its place, but there's still one more heavy to go. So next up is our final heavy tank this tier, the T-34. A huge heavy tank that really stands out in the class, and is leagues different to the previous three heavies. The T-34 is an entirely new design, featuring a 120mm cannon. This cannon only fires AP and APCR though, but the AP is really good. This thing can get through an absolute max of 283mm of armor, with great angled performance too. And comparatively, the reload isn't that bad, 19.4 seconds, especially when compared to the T26E1, also at 6.7. Mobility is also pretty good. It only has a max speed of 35 kph, but it comes with an 810 horsepower engine, which really lets it react and accelerate well. It also has neutral steering and can hit 13 in reverse. It also doesn't struggle to reach its max off-road speed, which is pretty nice for a vehicle this large and heavy. This thing is a 65-ton vehicle, and thankfully, all that weight has gone nicely into providing some pretty good armor protection. If slightly angled, the upper hull and side is immune to the long 88, unless at point-blank range. Without angling, guns like the long 75, short 88, 85, etc. can't get through the front plate apart from the machine gun port, which is pretty strong. Like all of these tanks though, the lower plate is a weak spot. The corners allow for any contemporary gun to get through, which isn't great. But if you angle, this can be mitigated slightly. The sides of the hull are the same thickness as the M26, so you can still comfortably angle and use the same maneuvering tactics to bounce shots. The turret doesn't scrimp on armor protection either. The mantlet is 203mm thick with a spall liner behind it, and the edges of the mantlet are entirely immune from basically anything. They're 305mm thick, with the turret face extending partially behind them as well, making this area really strong. The turret cheeks and side are 158mm thick all around, which will bounce a lot of weaker shells shooting at your turret from an angle. So this is a really well-rounded heavy, and as such, there isn't a huge amount to keep in mind while playing it. If you angle this thing like the Pershing and stay moving when being scoped in, the hull armor will be as good as it can be. If an enemy is aiming for your turret, try wiggling it around slightly from left to right. Not by too much, as this will give the enemy an easy shot into the cheeks, but just enough to get them to potentially bounce on the sides of your mantlet. Armor-wise, to me, this is one of the few vehicles in the game that I can play and not really feel scared of anything. I never really find myself getting into those uh-oh moments when running head-on into a tough enemy. This opinion doesn't really mean much in the grand scheme of things, but I just mention it because in my experience, the armor is very reliable most of the time. For shot placement, you're going to want to aim for one-shots. This cannon is great at it, and will be able to one-shot a lot of tanks from any angle really. If you can comfortably get through the armor of what you're fighting, try going for center mass. On tanks like the Panther, Leopard, Centurion, etc., a frontal one-shot is very reliable. So always try to aim for the part of the armor that will give you the widest cone of spalling. For example, if a tank is angling towards you, try and hit the diagonal line from the corner it's showing you, as this will give your shell the most travel time through the interior of the tank, and cause more potential damage while inside. You can generally just point and click on a lot of the tanks you fight though, to be honest. For King Tigers, it's safer to go through the turret even though you can get through the hull at close range. The hull of the KT is just on the cusp of the armor penetration this round has, which means once the shell breaks the armor, it lacks the residual energy to generate a lot of spalling. I'll just quickly show you what I mean. If we take a look at the hull here, if the round has just enough penetration to get through and we fire, it doesn't generate much spalling. But if we increase the effective angle, the round now does a lot more damage. So I wouldn't risk the front plate of the KT, just go through the turret. It might take 2 shots, but it's much safer, and you can easily stop them from running away. This thing has 3 frontal 50 cals, 2 in the mantlet and 1 on top, so you can disable tracks incredibly quickly with this thing. So if you aren't confident with one-shotting what you're fighting, aim to disable the breach, machine gun the tracks, and follow up from there. Apart from that, try to either hang back slightly around some cover to keep you safe while you reload, or if you're on the front lines, try to play around teammates. Much like the T26E1, you'll need to compensate for the reload. If you pull up on 2 enemies and take out one of them, the other knows they have around 15 seconds to disable you. And most of them, if they know what they're doing, will take that chance. So make sure you have some sort of time buffer around you. Apart from that, A lot of this tank's functionality is quite simple. You can pretty much put it wherever you like. Pros: great firepower, decent mobility, good armor, and versatile. And the cons: long reload. Verdict: definitely get this one. It's one of my favourite heavy tanks in the entire game, and it hits all corners of the tank trifecta decently enough. You can rely on your mobility to get you where you need to go and back out of situations relatively quickly. You can rely on your gun destroying any target you may fight, and you can rely on your armor to catch poorly placed shots. So I really recommend this one. It's also definitely worth a talisman too. So next up, a familiar anti-air vehicle. This is the M42 Duster. Not really functionally dissimilar at all to the M19. The Duster is on the chassis of the Bulldog and shares very similar mobility, although the Duster only has one reverse gear instead of the two the Bulldog has, so not quite as good. Not that it matters though, the main aspect here is the firepower, and sadly it's absolutely identical to the M19. Same traverse rate, same fire rate, same rounds. The only difference is that the Duster has slightly less gun depression. So there's not really anything to add here. It's not really different enough to the M19 to merit much meaningful discussion. Because it is slightly faster, you can play it a bit like a light tank on urban maps, rushing flanks and tearing up the light vehicles you meet on the way, but at 5.0 and above, it's not that reliable. You'll often run into vehicles that you'll struggle to scratch unless you get a perfectly flat angle. You can take out Panthers, Tigers, T-34s, etc., but you really do need to be flat on most of the time. From the front, sure, you can disable the barrel, but as the M42 uses the same turret effectively as the M19, machine guns can cut down all the turret crew very quickly. So it's still not the most reliable offensive anti-air. For going after aircraft, there's not really much to suggest apart from general anti-air practices. One thing I like to do with a Duster especially though, is wait until an enemy is close to me before firing, and watching its flight path. If the enemy is maneuvering, it's hard to hit them because the guns fire so slowly. But if the enemy is flying in a straight line, it gets much easier. If you're struggling, a good way to get a hint effectively with aiming is if an enemy aircraft is strafing the ground. If you line up your crosshair with their line of tracers, you can be a bit more accurate. Personally, I find this to be one of the easiest anti-airs to fall out of practice with. The M16 and other anti-airs like the Wirbelwind and Ostwind are much more forgiving due to their fire rate or shot spread, but you will generally cripple anything you hit with the Duster all the same, so it can work with some practice. It's still a vehicle that's effectively hard to learn, hard to master, but it can still be a bit more reliable after you use it for a while. Pros: decent anti-air ability, decent anti-tank ability, and good mobility. And the cons: poor survivability. Verdict: I'd consider it. It is still better than the M19 in several ways, but not really enough to justify focusing on unlocking it. If you have the M19 spaded, you can pretty much leave this one till last in this tier. You need it to unlock the later anti-air vehicles, so you will eventually have to grind it, but I'd probably leave it until last. And even so, the M16 is still fine, and workable and easier to aim. Much worse against tanks this tier, but a much more forgiving anti-air vehicle in general. So if you didn't like the M19, you won't like the Duster either, so there wouldn't be a massive drawback in just sticking with the M16 here. Lastly, for the tech tree today, we have the M36. This is a TD that was recently down-tiered to 5.3 using the 90mm M3 cannon and the hull of the M10, and it really is good for 5.3. It has the same turret traverse speed as the Shermans, and the 90mm gun at this BR is fantastic and rarely struggles with anything. Armor though, similarly to the M10, isn't very special. Any conventional gun can penetrate this thing at any range or angle. The mantlet is better and, like the Pershing, can bounce some rounds if a shell hits the edges, but this is extremely unreliable and barely a factor, to be honest. Mobility is pretty good though, even compared to the M18. Off-road, when spaded, the M36 just about matches the M18 in average straight line speed. It can reach the top speed of 42 kph pretty easily off-road, which is nice, although it means it won't get any sort of mobility boost on roads when compared to other vehicles with higher top speeds. It's not like its mobility is objectively better than the Hellcat though. The M36 is around 10 tons heavier, so turning and maneuvering still isn't as good, but still way better than average. Although the reverse speed suffers at only 5 kph, which does hurt the mobility a lot, especially in terms of survivability. This is a tank that really can't be hit, as, to be honest, it sort of has the worst amount of armor, not enough to stop any incoming shells, but just enough to set off APHE fuses. So it doesn't really fit into the old saying of no armor best armor. So positioning is of course key here. The poor reverse gear means that getting out of a tough situation isn't easy. This is one of those vehicles that doesn't really do anything for you. Its success depends entirely where you play it and your shot placement. If you mess up a shot or are positioned poorly, the vehicle doesn't have any intrinsic advantages to save you, and I think that's why it's at 5.3, despite being a very competent vehicle. Well, that and overpressure, which has hurt its performance a fair bit. The M36 works best when it's able to utilize some form of hard cover. Out in the open, it can just be clicked on. As always, it is possible to play like this if you're confident, but because an enemy doesn't really need to spend any time aiming at you to knock you out, it's definitely risky. But at the same time, you can pretty much do the exact same thing to the enemy, apart from some tanks like the Panther and IS-1. The weaker vehicles that you'll see in down tiers especially won't be much of a threat to you at all, but in up tiers, heading for a spot in cover that can potentially give you an angle onto the side armor of enemies is ideal really. Most maps have spots like this, and because of the great off-road speed of the M36, you'll almost always reach them in time. But if you're close to one of the core combat areas of the map, try not to stray too far from cover. Your mobility is good, but not good enough reactively to quickly back out of a confrontation. The M36 is still not a reliable frontline vehicle, and can't really be safely played like one. If you're in a one-on-one fight with an enemy who's aware of you and knows, for example, that you're waiting behind a wall or piece of cover, you have no ability to rush them or side scrape. Your hull can't really bounce anything unless you get extremely lucky. You're very vulnerable in situations like this. So, depending on what the map allows, either try to push the flanks and react to enemies from there, or find a sightline in the map that will let you get shots onto the enemy's side armor. Although, the gun is far from useless frontally. It's the strongest gun you have at 5.3, and actually it's one of the strongest guns in a turreted vehicle across all the trees of this BR. So even though head-on fights don't give you the most advantages, you'll still be able to disable pretty much anything you come up against. Apart from that though, it is a very general kind of vehicle. It just needs to be played quite safely. Pros: great firepower, good mobility, and versatile. And the cons: poor survivability, and slow reverse speed. Verdict: definitely get it. It makes a 5.3 lineup work much better in up tiers and can do things the Shermans and Jumbo can't do. It's a bit poor when out of its element, but if you can stay in cover and land your shots well, it makes for an incredibly strong TD at 5.3 and will work well beyond its BR as well. So, first for our premium vehicles this tier is one that's close to being unobtainable right now, the T30. This is basically just a T34, but with a different cannon, a 155mm gun, which I believe currently fires the largest APHE shell in the game for a tank. It can also fire a huge HE shell that can obliterate almost anything it hits. The APHE shell is great in terms of damage, but because of volumetric shells, it does commonly get caught on armor, leading to a non-pen, which is very annoying for this tank because of its stock reload, 38.9 seconds, which is incredibly long, and really hurts what this vehicle can potentially do. Although it is a lot of fun, these high caliber tanks often are. Its price though, less fun. This is an old event vehicle from late 2018, and is only currently available on the marketplace for, at time of recording, 150 Gaijin coins, which is not worth it at all really, from the perspective of an actual product. It is a fun vehicle, so if you have the money to burn, go nuts, there aren't many left for sale, but your money can absolutely be better spent elsewhere. Next up, we have the T28. This is a super heavy tank destroyer and also the slowest vehicle in the entire game, which may be an instant turn off for some of you. This thing is equipped with a very potent 105mm gun that can fire a very powerful APHE round, the T13 shell. This shell can get through over 250mm of armor at point blank range with 181 grams of explosive filler, which even causes overpressure because of how powerful it is. It also gets a strong APCR round, but because the APHE is so good, it doesn't really need it. Armor though is incredible, at least from the front. This thing is protected by 305mm of cast armor, making it frontally immune from every APHE and AP round that it can fight within the BR range, apart from maybe a Foch if it's firing at the armor from 10 meters away. Heat and some Sabo though will commonly get through, and frontally, APHE shells can detonate in the weakly armed cupolas with a good enough shot, which is a bit tricky as this can't be countered. The muzzle brake is also quite large and easy to knock out. And side armor is awful, at only 50mm thick, so even with a slight angle, any enemy can punch right through, and this combined with the T-28's max speed of 12 kph is not exactly quick to react to new threats. The T-28 is an incredibly niche vehicle and kind of tedious. It's incredibly easy to bomb, so you'll commonly die without really making a mistake while playing it. You can use cover to avoid bombs and rockets to an extent in lighter vehicles with more reactive mobility, but not in a vehicle like this. Because of how slow it is, it's possible on some of the larger maps that by the time you actually get to combat, you're already being bombed. It can be fun in the right situations, but it's very map dependent, and getting taken out is often out of your control. Not that great for a premium that costs 7,480 GE. Personally though, I don't hate it. I actually kind of like it. If you're a more defensive player, it can work quite nicely. And also, if you're perhaps an older player that might not have the reaction times of brawling or getting off snapshots, this thing is essentially so slow that it doesn't really allow you to make any mistakes or get into those sorts of situations, so it is good in that sense. It's not a vehicle you'll commonly be carrying games with, but it's slow and methodical and the gun is satisfying to use. In short, it's so niche that I can't really recommend getting it in a general sense, but if you like the idea of it, it can be enjoyable if you prefer the game at a slower pace, but you will absolutely get bombed a lot. Next up, we have the M6A2E1, a very egotistical vehicle. This thing is on the hull of the M6 Heavy with some additional armor on the frontal hull and a completely redesigned turret housing the same 105mm gun as the T-28. This thing was the top reward for Season 3 of the Battle Pass, and currently, at time of recording, is on sale on the marketplace for 35 Gaijin coin. This is a price that will definitely rise steadily in the future, as this vehicle likely won't be earnable again. But currently it is cheaper than a lot of the other options you have. Armor from the front is okay, but as it's on the base hull of the M6, the hull corners are rounded, so frontally despite the grey armor in the center of the hull, it doesn't offer anything reliable. Hull down it is better though. Apart from the optic port and the forehead, I guess, the mantlet and turret sides are immune to most common guns at the tier, the long 88, 122, etc, etc. So this isn't bad. It can be quite good at sniping as the weak spots here are less pronounced, but it does have a somewhat long reload of 20 seconds and not every map is going to offer this sort of cover. Although because it's so tall, it can use a lot of cover that other tanks just can't, so it can be fun poking this thing over cover that most enemies won't expect. Compared to the T-34 though, it's not as good. Armor is less reliable, mobility is far worse, although the M6 can travel as fast backwards as it can forwards, which can be nice, but generally it's much less reliable and versatile. The M6 can't really brawl at this tier, which relegates it to more of a TD playstyle. The gun is great and can be fun to use, but you already have a true heavy and a support heavy at the same BR, so buying this thing won't really give you anything new. You'd be much better off putting a talisman on the T-34, although if you do want to pick it up, now is the time because it will only get more expensive from here. Next up, we have the M46 Tiger, a brilliant vehicle, but a bad product in all honesty. I won't go into too many details about this vehicle here, but essentially it's an exact copy of the Tectri M46, which sits in rank 5, while this one is obviously rank 4. This almost entirely invalidates it. This thing is 7,480 GE, and a talisman on the Tectri M46 is only 2,000 GE, more than 3 times cheaper and able to research rank 6, which contains a lot more vehicles than rank 5. Because of how small tier 5 is and how large tier 6 is, rank 4 premiums do lose a bit of value here, although they're still great for SL all the same and usually have great lineups. Anyway, especially for a tank like this, I wouldn't recommend it if you're looking for a tank to help speed up late game research. Personally, I'd like to see this thing moved up to rank 5. It was introduced at a time where the game had no rank 5 premiums, so it couldn't be one. But now that we have them, it absolutely can, and honestly should, as it's a bit of a waste of money where it currently sits, relatively speaking to your other options. In fact, I probably would even say that even if it was tier 5, you'd probably get more for your money by getting a talisman on the regular version. It's still a great tank though, one of my favourites, but its performance as a vehicle doesn't match its potential product value, so at least for the time being, I'd recommend leaving this one. Next up, we have the M26E1, which by the time this video releases probably won't be available anymore, as after the 9th anniversary sale, it's being hidden from the tree if you don't already own it. Basically, this is a regular M26 with a functionally identical cannon to the long 90 found on the T26E1-1. This cannon bumps the reload of this Pershing up to 14.4 seconds stock, which is pretty poor, but the gun is of course fantastic. Although, as it's at 6.7, it's not as standout as it was a few years ago when this tank was released. Although it's always going to be one of my favourite tanks, I think. The armour, mobility and gun, despite their respective drawbacks, complement the overall vehicle very well. The gun doesn't struggle with anything, you can still bounce shots and get where you need to go. But for at the time 7,480 GE, it's a lot for something that's very similar to existing vehicles. It does do a great job of bolstering an already strong lineup, and to an extent, because the gun is so good, it can work in up tiers 2, making it pretty versatile with what you have, but it was probably the most, I guess, boring premium this tier, if you know what I mean, apart from maybe the M46 Tiger, so I guess that's probably why it was taken off the store. I still think it's a really fun and functional tank, but at the same time, you aren't really missing a huge amount. If any aspect of this tank interests you, it already exists in the tree in a disconnected way. So even though it's gone for now, don't mourn it too much. Next up, we have the M26 T99. This is essentially identical to the base M26, but with 44 M8 rockets strapped to either side of the turret. These are the same M8 rockets found on the Calliope, and they basically do the same job here as they did at 4.0. These rockets can't really reliably knock out any regular tanks of this BR, even from the side, but they can overpressure light vehicles and anti-air vehicles too, as well as disable tracks pretty easily as well. But it is an open ammo rack. Tank shells can one-shot you if they hit the rockets in the right spot, so it's not a straight upgrade. You're essentially somewhat compromising your armor protection at the expense of a gimmicky advantage, one that only comes into play against vehicles you could already take out easily anyway. That isn't a completely fair assessment, but more often than not it is the case, although you can use these rockets to disable heavier vehicles. It does definitely work, and sometimes you can luck your way into getting a kill on one of these vehicles. The rockets are also good for blinding or panicking heavier enemies as well. Against medium and heavy tanks, it's unlikely you'll get a rocket kill from the front, but it isn't impossible. And when you have a tank in front of you spamming rockets and you know that any one of them could potentially ammo rack you or take out your barrel, you're probably going to rush into firing a shot. Weapons like this do have somewhat of a fear factor, and you can use this to your advantage when playing aggressively. The rockets are only really effective at close range though. Their firing angle is linked to your gun elevation, which can make aiming difficult, especially as it means your gun isn't usable while you're arcing the rockets. So they're at best a situational advantage. For the same price of 7,480 GE, it's not really a standout option. It's still a Pershing, which is great, but it doesn't really offer anything reliable over the standard M26. In the right situation, sure, the rockets are going to work, but that right situation doesn't always materialize. And in the moments when it doesn't, all you really have is a big ammo rack. This is one that I'd only really recommend on sale, as you can just talisman the regular Pershing for a fraction of the cost and get an actively similar result. Again, it's not a useless vehicle by any stretch, but for what it offers, it's just okay as an advantage, and for a somewhat pricey product, you're going to want something that offers just a bit more than what's already available in the regular tree. Up next, we have the Super Hellcat, which basically just plops the turret of the M36 onto the standard M18 hull, which puts it all the way up at 6.3, and this thing kind of takes a half measure. Because of the added weight, the Super Hellcat is 4 tons heavier than the regular one, and being a light vehicle, extra weight with the same engine really does affect mobility. It accelerates a lot slower than the regular M18 forwards and backwards, and generally cruises at a much slower speed. The M36 at 6.3, with the same gun, is off-road comfortably faster than the Super Hellcat. Of course, the M36 lacks the reactive mobility the Hellcat had, which is a big drawback, but for some perspective, they're very close in off-road speed, and on-road, the regular Hellcat accelerates to speed much faster than the Super. It's actually really noticeable. But apart from that, the Super still has good mobility, objectively, and so all this really boils down to is a slower Hellcat with a better gun at a higher BR. And personally, I still quite like this vehicle. Not that my personal preference should have any impact on whether you should buy it, but the drawbacks in mobility don't exactly make it useless. It is less competitive at getting to good spots early in the map, but it still has just enough mobility to rush around the map from cover to cover and play just like a regular Hellcat. Like some other vehicles in the tree, the Super is just a Hellcat but scaled up to fight tougher tanks. So on that basis, its performance isn't increased by a huge amount relative to what you fight, to the point where, and I know I use this argument a lot, but I like being more critical of premiums as you have to pay for them, if you play the regular and Super Hellcat perfectly, they wouldn't really perform much different. With the Hellcat, you should be aiming to engage from the side or back, and if you're in that sort of location, the 76 is still getting through anything you hit. Apart from here, on the King Tiger H by the way, the turret ring extends down which can block 76 shots at the right angle. Probably should have put that earlier, but I've just remembered that and already recorded the previous stuff, so sorry. But the Super does offer you some safety. You're not always going to be engaging from the side. The 90 one-shots way more often, and you can quite easily get through Panthers and Tigers from the front. So it's less forgiving in some areas and much more forgiving in others. Hopefully you can see why I described it as a half measure though, in that the absolute standout feature the Hellcat had is much less impressive here. I guess if I were to summarise, there's less that you can do with the Super, but it's better equipped for the situations that it does actually engage in. And on that basis, I wouldn't say that it's vital to pick this one up, as it doesn't really let you do anything new. It is still a good vehicle, but not very forgiving. Although for 6090 GE, it is cheaper than the other options available to you. So that is something to consider. On sale, it's not bad for that price. Fast vehicles work in up tiers, so they do have better longevity as products. Outside of sales though, I'd only spend money on this one if you're really comfortable with the M18 playstyle. Lastly today, for the tanks, we have the T29. Very similar to the T34 and T30, but again, just with a different gun. The T29 comes with the same 105mm gun as the T28, and it really is good on this platform. Sure, the penetration is worse when compared to the T34, but the one-shot potential is much higher as we mentioned earlier. The reload is also shorter as well, at 16.2 seconds due to the two loaders. The mobility on the T29 is slightly worse though, but not really by a huge degree. It has a 770 horsepower engine compared to the 810 found on the other two tanks, but it doesn't negatively affect the T29 much. The faster reload and one-shot potential really keep this thing competitive at 7.0. The armor will be less competitive in up tiers, but your guns still will be, and this thing is still quite forgiving against Sabo and early heat. Because it's so large and the crew are very spread out, it's very hard to one-shot this thing if the incoming shell doesn't hit ammo. So if played a bit more warily, you can still take a couple of shots from the more modern vehicles you will end up fighting, which is really the best you can hope for an end-of-the-line heavy tank. Despite the comparatively low value of tier 4 premiums, this thing is still really good for what it is. It has a good lineup, it's versatile, and will help in unlocking a tier 5 lineup ready for breaking into tier 6. If by this point you already have tier 5 tanks though, I wouldn't buy it, just because talismaning tier 5 tanks is much more cost efficient than buying tier 4 premiums. And for the price of this thing, €40, you can get a lot of good talismans in rank 5. But if you are still in tier 4, this thing is a lot of fun. It makes a heap of lions and works well in almost every situation. It's probably still my favourite premium this tier. It doesn't add a huge amount over the T34 though, but you will still get a lot out of this one if you choose to pick it up. It's forgiving, satisfying, and works almost anywhere. I still wouldn't say that it's a requirement to buy it, as putting a talisman on the T34 will get you a similar result at a lower BR, but for lions and general fun, it's a great tank to play. This was always my sleepy tank back in the day. If I was ever tired or ill and still wanted to play the game, I'd play this one because I could just drive around and click on stuff and still usually come out positive. So if this does seem appealing to you, I would nudge you towards getting it, but it's still not a must-have. Next up, we have my picks for CAS aircraft this tier, and we're starting off with the AM-1 Mauler. This is a fairly versatile attacker that can carry a good load of ordnance. It can carry either 3 1,000 pound bombs with 2 drops, one 2,000 pound bomb and 12 250 pound bombs, one 1,000, two 500s and 12 HVARs, and a lot more loadouts as well actually, so you can really pick and choose what suits you best for this one. It also comes with 4 20mm cannons, which is still great against air and ground targets. I wouldn't call this thing agile, but it is still maneuverable. You can dogfight some of the heavier aircraft you see, and also perform high loops to get a good strafing angle on enemy tanks once spaded. This thing works well beyond its BR and especially well at 5.7, so I would definitely recommend this one. Next up is the AD4. This version is folded with the AD2, but is much better comparatively. Like the Mauler, it's equipped with 4 20mm cannons and a pretty wide loadout. The main one I personally use equips the AD4 with 2 1,000 pound bombs and one centrally mounted 2,000, along with a full wing of HVARs. What's good with the AD4 as well is that all of the bombs release separately, giving you 3 drops, which is a lot of potential kills. If you're not a fan of bombs though, it can also take out 56 FFAR Mighty Mouse rockets, which are small heat rockets with 290mm of penetration, which can defeat almost anything really, although they are placed far out on the wings, which do make them harder to aim. I don't think that this one is drastically better than the Mauler, but it is still better. As the AD4 is folded though and will take some time to unlock, you don't need to go through the AD2 first if you are happy with the performance of the Mauler, as in my experience, the AD4 is only marginally better. Next up is a premium. This is the F2G1. This version of the Corsair is very quick, comes with 50 cals and 2 bombs with separate drops. It's decently maneuverable and can fight in the airspace over the battlefield very comfortably. It is a tier 4 premium though, but a very cheap one. This was one of the rewards for the first season of the Battle Pass, and because so many were available as coupons, it's still only 7 Gaijin coin right now, for a versatile tier 4 premium. So if you're watching this and the price is still around this number, it's well worth getting. It doesn't have the most potential, but it's a great product for that price, and well worth using as your fighter in these lineups if you'd like to get it. As always, it isn't a requirement though, but if you are on the lookout for a cheap and effective boost to air research, I would recommend this one. Next up is a bit of a half recommendation. This is the F4U-4B, a very powerful aircraft. It comes with 4 20mm cannons and the ability to mount a few sets of bombs. 6 bombs that drop in pairs, 2 500s and 4 250s, not the most powerful but they still work, or 2 1000s that drop separately, which is still pretty nice. Less potential I guess, but more reliable overall. The F4U does struggle a bit to pull out of dives, but it is workable with some practice. Although, the reason why I say half recommendation is the repair cost at 17k. It's powerful but expensive, and if there are a lot of anti-air vehicles up, you might lose your plane without really doing anything, and that's a bit of a waste. I do like it and think that it can be worth taking, but if you do find yourself light on Silver Lions, it's best to skip this one honestly. Although, there's also an identical premium version on Xbox for $30. It's a great versatile fighter for AirRB and much cheaper to repair as well. So if you are interested in progressing through the air tree as well as the tank tree, and happen to play on Xbox, maybe check this one out. But as CAS planes are only situationally used in tank matches, it's not a requirement to buy it. Similarly, next up we have the P51H, an incredibly powerful fighter, but again with a big repair cost of effectively 20k. This thing can comfortably beat almost every common aircraft you'll see at this BR. It can even catch some of the early jets if caught making maneuvers. The H is somewhat lacking regarding CAS though, only being able to take out a max of 2 500-pound bombs and 6 HVARs, although it can carry 2 1,000-pound bombs separately. So it can still knock out 1 or 2 tanks and then focus on clearing out the air, which it is very capable of doing. And it's this reliability as a fighter that makes it worth considering, only though if SL is not really something you struggle with. If it is, other similar fighters, or even some from a lower BR, will work fine in this role. But the H is still a great plane, so I still think it's worth mentioning. Lastly, we have the F8F1B, the Bearcat. Quite a cute looking fighter that comes with 4 20mm cannons and 3 1,000-pound bombs with 2 drops. It's decently maneuverable on top of this, but does bleed speed very quickly in looping maneuvers and becomes quite sluggish in this state. So managing your energy is important with this one. Either way though, with the bombs or even clean wing, it's a very effective aircraft for tank matches, and comparatively cheap to repair too. So this one really is worth it. So there we are guys, that's everything for today. On screen now are the best lineups I think you can make using vehicles from this tier and below. Of course you can swap out the aircraft to what you prefer, this is mostly just my personal preference, what I like using, but you can use anything that works really. And as well, I would probably expect the T26 to go up at some point because there's no way that it can stay where it is right now with the armor that it has, it's just way too good basically. So I would expect that one to go up a fair bit. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Sorry it was a bit long, probably a bit too long, maybe I should cut these down a bit, I'm not quite sure yet. But thankfully, as Tier 5 only has a handful of vehicles compared to this tier, I'll be able to get that one done a lot quicker. So yeah, thank you for watching all the way to the end. I imagine a lot of people probably don't get this far, so thank you for that. Thanks for being here, I really do appreciate it. Yeah, feel free to pick up the decal as well, if you like. It's only just been added to the files properly today, so when I'm recording right now, it's not actually available yet. Hopefully, well, by the time this comes out, the link should be working. Hopefully, anyway. I'm not sure how that's all going to work yet, but it should all be fine. Yeah, I wasn't really sure what to do for the decal. Like, I've had the link for over a year, the affiliate link, but I just didn't really know what to use as a decal, so the stream basically came up with the idea for me and kind of went from there. It's a bit silly, but hopefully it's, I don't know, I wanted to make something kind of fun, I guess, that people could do silly things with and that kind of thing, so hopefully it fills its purpose for that. Anyway, I won't take up any more of your time. I've already annexed too much of your day with this video, so thanks. As you can tell, I'm very bad at doing sign-offs and goodbyes. I always manage to drag them out for as long as possible. Sorry about that. Anyway, I will see you next time for Rank 5. As always, thank you very, very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.